soon we're going to figure this out. But let me just start it off. I'm Matt from the one of the outgoing GEA members, along with Will over here and Francois, who unfortunately could not be here. We're really excited. We've had a lot of fun organizing this event. We're excited to hear Professor Wolinsky's lecture, as we imagine all of you are as well. Just a few quick things before I cede the floor. First, along with thanking all of you guys for coming here, we really want to thank Norma Hardio for all of her work putting this lecture on. Even though this is only our third one, we know that she does this year in, year out, so it's really, really cool. So I think that's it. Oh, and also very importantly, I just want to reiterate that after the lecture, we're going to have the reception and dinner at the BU Castle, which is over at 225 Bay State Road. For those of you who don't know, just a few minutes walk from here. If you don't know where it is, just follow the crowd. So I'm going to give the floor to Kevin Lang, who's going to talk a little bit about Bob Rosenthal's legacy, who will then cede the floor to Bart Lippman, who will introduce our speaker, who will then cede the floor to Asher. So without further ado, Kevin.
So thank you. I want to start, before I talk a little bit about Bob, with just this series of thank yous. First and foremost, thank you to Bob's family, Janet Stradley, Ruth Rosenthal, Liz Rosenthal, without whose generous contributions this event would not happen. It's a really important event, as you all know, and we are very grateful for their willingness to continue supporting it. I also want to thank, not by name, but the various faculty and alumni who have been donating to the endowment fund for this lecture, so we know that it is inevitable that at some point Bob's family will not be able to continue to support the lecture, and we hope that when that happens we will have raised sufficient funds that this very important event can continue in perpetuity. I want to thank Asher and the previous speakers who've been so kind as to donate their time and allow us to have the time to grow, I hate that verb, but grow the endowment fund so that we can have this in perpetuity. I also want to thank Jay Zagorski, who was just thinking about his experience struggling with game theory with Bob Rosenthal when he was a student here, who's been kind enough to do the videotaping for us this year, and we hope that that will be a continued undertaking in the future. For those of us who knew and loved Bob, this is a very bittersweet time. I realize at this point that about half of the faculty were never Bob's colleagues, and of course none of the graduate students who are here had the opportunity to take a class with him. For me, it's a very special opportunity to remember him. It's something I do quite frequently. I think about Bob very, very often, but it's also, those memories are both painful because he's not here, but also special because I know that we are honoring him in a way actually that he wouldn't appreciate because he didn't like to be honored. But we do it anyway. It's very hard to describe Bob to people who didn't know him. About a year ago, I was having dinner with a well-known labor economist who said to me, Kevin, how did you learn to be such a good theorist? And I know my colleagues would think that was a joke, but it wasn't intended as one. And I started to tell the story of beginning to work with Bob. And the background to the story is I had had a paper accepted at a premier journal. I won't cast aspersions on the paper by telling you which journal it was, but it was one of the top 5. And I had some issues that I thought I ought to run by Bob before I actually sent it in for the final publication. Bob said he would take a look at it. And as Bob's one, he was very helpful, and he got back to me very quickly. and told me in no uncertain terms that it was an outrage that the paper had been accepted. and the labor economist to whom I was talking was just horrified that anybody would do this. But those of us who knew Bob, this was not
It's a compliment.
it was. I don't know if people could hear. Larry Kotlikoff said it was a compliment. It was at least a statement that he thought it was worth spending time with me to make me a better economist. And you have to understand it in the context of how hard Bob was on himself. He is reputed to have said, he's responsible for the revelation principle, which all of you know is extremely important. When somebody wrote down a particular formalization, he's reputed to have said, why would anyone bother writing that down? He did not think the revelation principle was worth publishing. This was typical. He had high standards, and he was willing to help people meet those high standards. I guess one other story before I finish what I was saying about that episode, which really did help me become a much better theorist. I think the first year that Bob and I were here, we arrived together, I was put in charge of junior faculty recruiting. And as you can imagine, for those, well, actually, many of you have not been on the other side, but those of you who've been on our side know you get to the point where for the 15th or 20th time, you've done the sales pitch about how wonderful BU is. And I was tired of doing it, and Bob was in the room with me, and I thought, well, it'd be interesting to see what Bob thinks is great about our department. And I said, well, Bob, why don't you do the sales pitch? Well, this was not a Larry Kotlikoff sales pitch. He started off with, well, we're a mediocre department. At which one asked them which departments were not mediocre, and I think there were 2 or 3. And being mediocre, I think, put us in the top 20. But that was Bob. So those criticisms were never, although they were strong, and it was important that I hear why he didn't like the paper. He sat down with me, and we worked through a variant of the model, not the same one that was published in the top 5 journal, but we worked through a variant of the model and ended up publishing our first paper together. And we went on, because I enjoyed working with him so much, to publish a second paper on a different topic. And my CV would be a whole lot longer and better if Bob were still around. I think of him often when Michael complains about my proofs, about how much better they are than they were before I met Bob. I continue to miss him very much. I'm delighted. I know he really appreciated Asher, so I'm really delighted that Asher is here. And I'm going to hand over the introduction to Bart.
Given that the mic doesn't work, I don't know why I'm standing here, but I guess it's a focal point. Anyway, so it's a pleasure to introduce Asher Wolinsky as the speaker for the 12th annual Rosenthal lecture. I think Asher was an excellent choice for 2 reasons. First, he's an excellent economist. I'll say a few words to try to convince you of that in a moment, but I'll mostly rely on his lecture to persuade you of that, because I think it'll be a lot more persuasive than I could be. Second, kind of echoing some of the things Kevin was saying, this lecture, of course, is a way to keep the memory of Bob Rosenthal alive. And for those of you that didn't meet Bob, if I had to try to describe him to you, it's an imperfect way of describing him would be to say, look at this guy. Asher reminds me a lot of Bob. He's taller, but otherwise he reminds me an awful lot of Bob. Partly there's the excellent economist thing that I just mentioned, but it goes a lot beyond that. First of all, I think of Bob and Asher both as people who use economic theory to try to say something about the real world around them. Both of them like quote-unquote pure theory and wrote some very elegant papers that would be called by most of us, I think, pure theory. But judging from both their vitas, what they really cared about was saying something real and meaningful about the world around us. Second, as with Bob, as you heard in Kevin's story, you know where you stand with Asher. He's a very polite man, but let's say he's very direct. So if you had a chance to talk to him about things you were thinking about earlier today, you might have heard a strong view, which is useful, as Kevin was just noting. Finally, Asher is a very serious-minded person, and I don't mean by that he's not going to make a joke. But what I mean by that is he doesn't play games with this stuff. He does game theory, but that doesn't mean he plays games. He takes these things very seriously. And so one reflection of this that I just loved. So in order to prepare for this introduction, I looked up his Vita. So I hope I'm not going to embarrass him with this, but he is the only person I know whose Vita lists selected publications. Okay, so in other words, there are papers that he published that he didn't think were good enough to be on his Vita. So I did a little bit of Googling to try to find them. And I can't guarantee that I found all of them, but I found 10 papers, including one in the Review of Economic Studies, top 5 journal, 3 in Games and Economic Behavior, one of them co-authored with Aldo Rustachini, another co-authored with Ariel Rubinstein, and yes, both of them list those papers on their Vitas. So, in short, looking over these papers, I didn't go out and read all the 10 of the papers, but in short, he's left off his Vita what would arguably be a tenurable Vita in its own right, which I find impressive. So, a little bit, so now completely embarrassing, a little bit of information about Asher. So he received a BS in Math and Economics from Hebrew University, and an MA and PhD from Stanford. He's been a fellow of the Econometric Society since 1991. This past October, Asher was inducted as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is a great honor, along with the 2 guys you might know, the Steen brothers, Larry Epstein and Bruce Springsteen. You may have heard of them. Asher is or has been on the editorial boards of Econometrica, JET, GEB, even though he disregards their papers, and AJ Micro. We tried to get him on the board of TE, that's a long story. He's published at least, as far as I know, 15 papers in top 5 journals. I suspect more that I couldn't find. Asher was one of the key people in developing models which blended matching and bargaining as a way of understanding competitive equilibrium. His work with Matt Jackson in their 96 JET paper really triggered the huge literature on networks. He's written a great deal on the role of asymmetric information in competition and the organization of the firm. And recently has written several interesting papers with Eddie Deckel and Matt Jackson on book buying. So, without further ado, let me turn it over to Asher Wolinsky.
Before I start, I just mention how moving I found the words that Kevin said about Bob. I was a colleague of Bob for 1 year. This was my first job. And Bob, besides being an original and very insightful researcher, was, as you heard, is very sharp critic. But first of all, to be sharp critic, you have to be sharp. So he was very sharp. And he had this warmth in him that made him such a lovable individual. So it was really, I really loved Bob. Now, so it's a great, it's very exciting for me to give this lecture. This is part and this is part. Now, okay, now to the lecture. I'm going to talk about information aggregation in large market, and this is based on work by Lauerman and myself over the last few years. So we have these two papers, and I will present results from these two papers and some other things. So I'm going to talk about common values environment, and there are many participants with private signals. And the question is, to what extent price has formed the natural trading modes, aggregated, dispersed information that agents have. Interest in this question owes to the fact that information aggregation by prices may affect the efficiency of the market allocation. The focus of this talk is on information aggregation by certain price formation modes that are interesting because they are natural or widespread. It is different from the question of how to design a mechanism to aggregate information well, which in this environment that I'm going to talk about should not be a problem. So this is not in the mechanism design tradition, but just in the more natural tradition of describing, looking at the known mechanisms and asking about the properties. As I mentioned, this work is the new results that I have to tell you about will be taken from these two papers by Lauerman and myself. So let me say a few words about the significance of the question of information aggregation. So this is a fundamental question of economic theory. It's part of the broader question of how the price system performs the allocation of resources. The centrality of this question is why sometimes the whole of traditional microeconomic theory is called price theory. The information aggregation by price question was tackled systematically, as you know, by the rational expectations literature. And the subsequent step in this investigation is in environments with strategic agents. Milgrom and Wilson addressed this question in the context of auctions. Most likely they didn't have in mind a structured auction that's being designed for some purpose, but rather as a component of a market price formation. But this is a discussion of auctions is just the beginning. Auction is not the only way to think about price formation. Other modes could give rise to different insights. The interest in this problem is not because there is literature by important people on the subject and some crumbs might be left and we run to collect them, but rather there is a literature because this is a very fundamental question and it remains a fundamental question. So I would like to start by presenting a common framework that, with which I will discuss some different modes of price formation. So we have a single seller and n potential buyers. The state is denoted by W, and it could take one of a finite number of values 1 through n. And what is a state? Alternatively, you can think of it as the seller's type or the quality of the unit that the seller has to sell. So this is what I mean by state. There are prior probabilities denoted by rho over the possible states. The buyers have common value, so they all value the unit that the seller has for sale. They all have the same value for the unit, and this is denoted by VW. It depends on the state, so it takes a finite number of values, and they are all the VW is smaller than VW plus 1. Payoffs of a transaction at price P for a buyer who is involved is VW minus P. And for the seller is P, is the revenue from selling the unit. So the seller, you can think about it, the cost of the seller is normalized to 0. So this is the common framework within which I will talk about some modes, and this is a framework that I'm sure is familiar to you completely. Now, W is a private information of the seller. Only the seller knows the state or the quality of the goods. Each buyer observes a signal X taken from an interval X lower bar, X upper bar. Conditional on W on the state, the signals are IID. They are distributed with a cumulative distribution function GW with density little GW that's strictly positive on x lower bar, x upper bar. Okay, so x lower bar, x upper bar is the interval of values that the signal might take. Now, the likelihood ratio GW plus 1 over GW at x is weakly increasing. And I make these two assumptions that at the bottom, this likelihood ratio is smaller than 1, and at the top is larger than 1. And it being strictly increasing means that the most favorable signal is x upper bar, the most of the value of the good, and the least favorable is x lower bar. And of course, higher signals, because of the increasing likelihood ratios, higher signals are more indicative of higher values than lower signals. Now, we will say that signals are boundedly informative if even the best signal, the likelihood ratio at the top, is finite. So that means even when you get the best signal, it still doesn't completely separate the different values. And we say it's unboundedly informative if it's infinite. The likelihood ratio at the top is infinite. So that means that there are signals so good that they nearly perfectly distinguish between the different values. Okay, now, so this is the framework, and we can speak now about different regimes within this framework. So first of all, as a benchmark, I want to start with assume there's complete information. So W is known to all buyers, so this X is a perfect signal. So if you think in this environment that I've described, you think of competitive equilibrium, or equilibrium of various auction formats. The equilibrium will be, as you probably know, that the price in state W will be VW. The value will be known to all buyers, and they will say competing some sort of, if it's an auction, first price auction, they will compete in some Bertrand fashion, and the price will be equal to the value, and it aggregates all the information there is. I mean, equal to the value. If there is no information whatsoever, the signals have no informative signal, the buyers have no informative signals, then competitive equilibrium and equilibrium of various auction formats will give you the price in state W is equal to the expectation of VW in all states. Because buyers simply have no information, and if they have to bid for the good, this is what we will bid. The prices contain no information about the state. So these are the two benchmarks. Now I would like to speak about three alternative scenarios in this framework that I present. So the first one is ordinary first price auction. In ordinary first price auction, there are little n buyers, which is a number smaller than the total, smaller equal total potential number of buyers participate. These participants observe, they know how many participants there are. So little n is known to them, is commonly known. Participants privately observe the noisy signals from the technology that I described to you, these X signals. Then they simultaneously bid, and the price is the highest bid. First price auction format that we all know. I want to describe the second scenario that I would like to discuss is sequential search. Here, the seller, the auctioneer, samples buyers sequentially at some positive cost per observation. A sampled buyer observes a signal X with the same technology that I described before, does not observe the history of the search, the buyer who is being contacted doesn't know whether the seller has contacted other buyers before or how many of them. Then they bargain over the price, when just the two of them. They have some mechanism to decide whether they transact and if so, at which price. And it could result in a trade at some price or disagreement. A trade at some price terminates this interaction. If there's disagreement, the buyer continues searching. So this is a sequential search in this same framework. Now, a third scenario that I want to discuss is auction with the endogenous bids solicitation, or you can think of it as simultaneous search. Here, the seller solicits a batch of buyers at a cost per buyer. The number of solicited buyers may depend on the state, so the seller knows the state. The solicited buyers privately observe the noisy signals from the technology that I described, this access. And the buyers do not observe the number of other solicited buyers, so they don't know how many other bidders the seller is summoning. And then they simultaneously bid, and the price is the highest bid. So this is, if you wish, this scenario is a hybrid of these two scenarios. There is bidding like in the auction, but there is a sampling. It's not exactly like in the sequential search, because it's simultaneous, but there is a sampling effect, which in some sense resembles what goes on in the search model. So these are the three scenarios I'm going to discuss. Yes?
And the third one, the auction occurs right away, or is it?
Yes.
I mean, the second one, they could, not make a deal and move on.
This is right.
So why isn't the first one preferred by the seller?
It might be, I don't say what preferred. These are just three different scenarios. I'm not saying that the seller is optimizing by choosing them or even has the ability to choose them. This is how it is. These are three different scenarios. So this scenario, suppose you need a repair at your home, for example. This scenario means you take one repairman, and then another, and then another, and then another, until you conclude with somebody. This says you do what I do. You invite a few simultaneously. They don't arrive all at the same time, but you invite them simultaneously, and then hear all of them, and then decide.
So the key thing is the cost.
There is a cost, yeah.
So
It costs in here and here, in both of these. You can put the cost up there, but there it's not important because there the n is given exogenously, so it's not important if the buyer, if the seller bears the cost. It doesn't have a decision on the number of this. So I want to comment on these three scenarios. The ordinary auction is the ordinary auction. You know it all, right? The sequential search, it's also somewhat a familiar scenario, although here you have this adverse selection and signals, you have some elements that maybe you didn't see in ordinary search mode. The third scenario falls between the other two, as I mentioned, endogenous solicitation like in the sequential, the price formed in bidding like in the auction. You can think of it if there's a paper by Burdett and John, a well-known paper on simultaneous search, or batch search model. You can think of it as an incomplete information version of that model. Because here we have the behavior exactly the model, but we have the additional element that the buyer has this private information about the value of the good. Now, these models, all of them, the way I describe them, they look at the sale of one unit. They can be straightforwardly embedded in a market model with many sellers and many buyers without changing any of the mathematics, basically. It's just calling things by different names. So you can think of them, if you want, at the back of your mind, think this is these are components of a large market model. And I just chose to describe it as a sale of single unit to make things simpler. Now, the second and third models were not tailored for a specific application. So they come from this joint work that I mentioned to you. And we didn't think of them as an attempt to analyze a specific market or specific institution. But they seem to have some relevance for a number of economic situations. I want to mention one that I think is interesting. If you think of the market for loans, you think of a borrower with private information. This would be the counterpart of the seller in our model, applying for a loan to multiple lenders. This would be the counterpart of the buyers in our model. So he could do it sequentially. He could go to one bank and then to another and propose the project, or could do it simultaneously, send applications to a few. So I think this would be an interesting application, although I didn't think about its details. I'm just mentioning it as a potential application with this sort of information structure. Brocker and Reardon, they model the situation of somebody looking for a loan as a standard common value auction. But I think that this approach or this model would be more interesting because it's an endogenous decision by the borrower of how many banks to contact, whether it's simultaneously or sequentially, could be of some importance for this situation. So having introduced the three price formation models, we will now inquire about information aggregation about prices. We say that prices aggregate information well if they are near the true values. If the price in state W is near VW. Prices aggregate no information if they are the same across all states. And then, of course, you have all sorts of intermediate situations. So I want to start with information aggregation in a large common value auction. So I go to the first scenario. It's a first price common value auction with n bidders. So I want to think of a large such auction with many bidders. So how do I do it? And we look at a sequence of such auctions indexed by K, where the number of participants denoted by nk goes to infinity over this sequence. We look at the corresponding sequence of equilibria of these auctions. And the equilibrium price, let PWK be the winning bid in auction K in state W. This is a random variable. We can talk about, then we denote by P upper bar W as the limit of these reaches in probability if such a limit exists. Okay. And by F upper bar W is the limit distribution of the winning bid in state W. So this will be, again, I'm talking about a sequence of auctions where the number of bidders, these auctions are not related. It's not that there are some strategic links between the auctions. I'm just looking at a sequence of economies with larger, exceedingly larger number of bidders. And I'm asking myself how the sequence of prices behaves. More precisely what the limit is like. So observation with very informative signals, namely if the likelihood ratio at the top is high for all W, the prices in this auction aggregate information well. Formally, what do I mean? This limit price over the sequence of auctions with increasing biddership is the value for all W if and only if the likelihood ratio at the top is infinite for all W. If for all W, the likelihood ratio at the top is finite but large, the price will be close to VW for all W. In other words, you look at this distribution, it places the most weight. When we're talking about this, it places the most weight. There will be a distribution of winning bids. It will place the most weight near VW. and the expectation of the price in state W with respect to this distribution will be near VW. Remarks about this observation. First of all, one is due to Milgrom. And you should also see Wilson, the result is really derived in Milgrom, but Wilson discussed this question earlier. He made some more special assumptions, and his result is not as sharp because it's under some special assumption, but he really came up with this question and the first sort of answer, although the full result is in Milgrom. Now, number two, I stated it is a result, but I think it is a result in the sense that if you go through Milgrom's argument, you'll see that it also nearly holds, it's true for if you can just go through the argument for large likelihood ratio that's not finite. But I didn't go through this argument step by step, so you can take it as almost result, but not. But I did check it for two. For when you have two, this I know for sure that what I'm saying here is true. When I have more than two, I'm 99.9 sure that what I'm saying is true, but I don't want to go the other 0.1%, because anyway I'll have to attribute it to Milgrom. So you just go with Milgrom's argument, and you'll see that it must be true, but I didn't really do it. But if you take it, it must be true. Believe me, I worked with these models long enough to know that this is probably true. Okay, so the auction aggregates information well. When the likelihood ratio at the top is high, it aggregates well. In other cases, probably less well. Here is the picture of what happens in the auction. Do you see it very well? Because I made also a paper copies of this picture. Do you see everything in this picture? Also, you see the labeling on the axis. Are you sure? Oh, so this is the labeling I prepared it. Okay, maybe I'll give it to you anyway, because you know, since I prepared it, it will be a souvenir for me. So this is, all this picture is saying is that when the likelihood ratio at the top is infinite, you get full aggregation of information, prices equal to values. And when it is large but not infinite, you get a curve that's similar to this one. Okay, close to it. This is information aggregation in the large common value. Okay. Again, let me see, I said here's the picture, maybe you don't. Here I drew the different states, 1 through n, and here are the prices on this axis, and these dots correspond to price equal, so in state 1, the price will be, the limit price will be V1. In state 2, it will be V2, and so forth. And the dot, 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 just this means that, to say this is how it continues everywhere.
Can you just give us the intuition for that condition that equals infinity?
Yeah. What does it mean for this to be equal to infinity? It means that there are signals that are very, very strong, that if you get the signal close to x, if you get the signal in the absence of any other information, if you just get a signal that close to x upper bar, it's much, much more likely that it's W, and you know it's either W plus 1 or W, it's much, much more likely that it's W plus 1. If you have just a signal and it's not interfered with any other information, the signal is very revealing. You have signals that tell you, they're so good that they tell you with it's very likely that the likelihood of one stage over the other is very, very large. And this perfect aggregation occurs if and only if this is the case. If and only if. But I'm telling you also that even if it's not infinite, if it's finite but large, it will be nearly there. But this is all a benchmark to the things I want to say next. So now I want to talk about the sequential search. The sequential search will address selection. So we have a single seller, and let this capital N be infinite prospective bias. So the seller can sample as much as she wants. The seller samples buyers sequentially at the cost S. I'm just reminding you things that I said, that each sampled buyer observed a signal X drawn out of this distribution G. It's the same signal that a bidder gets in the auction, exactly the same. Seller and buyer, once they meet, they bargain over the price. Agreement results a trade at the agreed price and the end of the whole process. Disagreement means continued search. I leave this in a black box. I don't tell you how they bargain. They bargain somehow. Okay. The payoff of ending with transaction P after n buyers being sampled for the transacting buyer is this, VW minus P, the value minus the price, and the other buyers is 0, of course, and the seller is P minus NS. So the seller incurs this cost of sampling. So if the seller had to look at n buyers, this is the cost. And I gloss here, of course, over modeling details of varying importance, like how exactly we model the bargaining component and things like this. So I'm just not telling you, I'm just leaving it in a blank. So I want to talk about information aggregation in this model. So look at a sequence of such model indexed by K. Again, look at a sequence of such models. They are separate from each other, but just a sequence of such models. What changes from model to model is the cost of sampling, SK. The cost that the seller incurs per sampling a buyer. And this goes to 0 over the sequence. So sampling becomes easier and easier over the sequence. And look at the corresponding sequence of equilibria. Take an equilibrium for each such version of the model and look at the sequence. And the equilibrium price, the transaction price in version K in state W will be a random variable. We will denote by PWK the expectation of this, the expected transaction price in version K in state W. And by P upper bar, look at the limit of this, when the sampling cost goes to 0. Okay, so again, I have a sequence of such models, differing by this marginal search cost. And it goes to 0 over the sequence. I look at the sequence of corresponding equilibria and look at the equilibrium prices rising there, the sequence and its limits. So I want to show you what happened here in terms of what happens here in terms of information aggregation in the sequential search. So this is the picture for the case in which the likelihood ratio at the top is finite. It could be finite, but it could be large as you want, but finite. The result is no aggregation whatsoever. The prices in the limit are equal to the expected value. I told you that in the auction, they will be, if the likelihood ratio at the top will be finite but high, you'll have a curve similar to what I showed you with a pretty good aggregation. Here, no aggregation whatsoever, no information whatsoever. Now, what does it look in the sequential search when we have the likelihood ratio at the top is infinite? This is what this picture tells us. If the signals are unboundedly informative, namely the likelihood ratio of every adjacent curve is infinite, namely you have such signals that are so good they distinguish any adjacent curve very well. Generically, this is what the curve would look like. And when I say what it looked like, again, I remind you, here are the states, these are the different states, and these are the prices. The curve will be, look like, there will be pools. The pools could be a singleton, which this means if you look at this picture, means that in state 1, the price fully aggregates the information. In state 2, the price fully aggregates the information in this picture, but in states 3, 4, and 5, they are completely pooled, and the price is equal to the expected value conditional on these states. So this will be a typical picture. It will be a succession of pools. The pools will be of adjacent states. In particular, the previous picture is a special case of this. It's the special case in which the pool, there's just one pool. And this could also happen, this picture could also, it's not just formally a special case, it could happen with infinite likelihood ratio at the top. This picture could arise. You could have a situation in which you have these excellent signals, but likelihood ratio at the top is infinite for any pair, and still, in the limit, the prices will aggregate no information. So this is one kind of picture you can have when the likelihood ratio at the top is infinite, but you can have other forms. In particular, you can have some pools, and some singletons, or you can have all singletons, which would be perfect information aggregation. So this is depending on these distribution functions, the G's, and the relationships between them that I will say a word on in a minute. You can have different forms, but the idea is you will not have perfect information, necessarily perfect information aggregation. You can have perfect complete pooling, or you can have partial pooling like described in this picture.
Sure.
Yes?
So, in the first auction, I think I get it that if you have enough players, enough buyers, then one of them is bound to have the highest signal, and if that's completely revealing, that guy's going to bid up the price for what the thing is worth. And that's why you get the price that's equal to value. Only the reliability of the best signal is going to count, because there are enough guys that somebody's going to get the best signal. In the other ones, I'm a little confused. I mean, it seems like if the state is low, it's not worth the sweat of the seller to get a lot of guys. And because of that, you don't get to the best signal. I mean, is that what's going on?
First of all, no. Yes and no. Yes and no. This tension exists, but first of all, I want to do not Milgrom's result in the auction. Do not minimize it too much, because there is. You're right that they're looking. There'll be somebody with very good signal, but remember, when there are many bidders, there are also winner skills. So this guy, it's not completely trivial to say somebody will get a good signal and they will bid up, because they have to take into account the winner skills. And this is so you have something to argue that. So Milgrom's result is not sort of immediate. You have to take this into account. So this is in defense of Milgrom. Now here, remember the search cost becomes small, so you might have a lousy quality. But you say, you know what, I'll continue something until I find some sucker who will get a good signal, and I'll sell it to them. And this is why you might get even, I'm telling you that even when the signals are, you have signal, the likelihood ratio at the top is infinite. I can give you examples in which all in the limit, there will be complete pooling, no aggregation whatsoever. And the intuition is what I said. When the search cost is small, there's also the number of bidders is not fixed. You want to sample more and more and more until you get somebody who will have a good signal. So it's worth for you. If it's not very expensive to sample, and you think somebody will get a very good signal eventually, I will sample a lot of people.
So why is there so much pooling then? That's what I don't see.
This is why our result is not trivial. Remember, I told you that you always have this pooling when the likelihood ratio at the top is finite. When the likelihood ratio at the top is finite, that means that somebody with a bad quality, with a low value, it's only a few times more expensive for them to get any signal than even the best signal, in only a few, some finite multiple more expensive for them to get a good signal than somebody with the best good. So if the search cost is small, they will, it might not be very costly for them. This is not the whole argument, but you have to establish that somehow the aggregate search cost is small. But this is more or less the intuition. Now I want to say something, another word on this result, because I showed you, I told you many forms of information aggregation can arise when the likelihood ratio at the top is finite. So I want to tell you some words about it. So first of all, perfect information aggregation requires, this is a necessary condition, that the likelihood ratio at the top will be infinite. Because you saw when it's finite, there is definitely complete pooling. Now, but this is not enough. It has to be that when the signal goes to the top, these likelihood ratios go to infinity at a sufficiently fast rate. You need something more to get a good information aggregation. And the precise requirement is all summarized by this measure of informativeness. So this measure that defines for any pair, for any such pair of distributions, we call it lambda ij. We have several definitions for it, but this is one of them. It's the likelihood ratio normalized, as you see, by something. Now, this could be, this could take, in principle, depending on gi and gj, this could take values, this could be 0, this could be infinity, or this could be any number between 0 and infinity. But this measure, this is an informative measure. You see, it measures how, because of course this goes to infinity, the denominator. So if this is to be large, or it has to be going to infinity faster than this. Now, of course, when the likelihood ratio at the top is bounded, is finite, this will be 0. Because this goes to infinity and this will be bounded. So if this to be non-zero, it has to be that the likelihood ratio at the top is now, if you go to the graph, if I and j are pooled, it has to be that lambda ij is equal 0. So we go here. To get something like that, it has to be that this lambda 3,5 is equal 0. And of course, lambda 3,4 will also have to be equal 0. So this is the informative measure, alternative to the just likelihood ratio. This is the informative measure that tells us if we calculate, give me a family of distributions, and I will calculate these measures lambdas, and I will tell you what this picture looks like. So if the lambda 1 m will be 0, which could happen, it will be it will be complete pooling. So this is this lambda measure. Now this is where the genericity qualification that I mentioned comes in. Generically, in some sense, these lambdas are either 0 or infinity. There are non-generic cases also that you could take values in between, but generically, in some sense that we adopt, they could be either 0 or infinity. So that means that two adjacent states will be either fully pooled or fully separated. Infinity is connected, this lambda being infinity means this separating information is very good in the sense that it's not just the likelihood ratio going to infinity, but the rate that it is doing it is very fast. So that means between these two, you have this lambda is infinity. Between these guys is 0. And generically, it could be either one or the other. Yes?
And all these results are independent of the bargaining method?
Well, I cannot, I want to answer yes. Of course I want to answer yes, but I cannot answer yes. So in what sense it is and it is not. Of course we assume a certain bargaining protocol. It is, so this is what we do. But we tried in earlier versions of this paper at least 2 other bargaining protocols. We get the same results for all 3. So I cannot tell you that there is no some 7th bargaining protocol that you know. But intuitively, why do I want to say it doesn't depend on the bargaining? Because the real forces in this model are not the bargaining. The bargainers have something very little to talk about. The real forces here are the search and the information. And they give you, they sort of press everything together, that whatever the bargainers they do it in this way or that way or another way, it's not very important. This is an intuitive answer. But if you ask me, did we check other bargaining protocols? Yes, we checked them. And this bargaining protocol, by the way, that I didn't tell you about, it involves some random prices popping up or something. And the distribution that generates these prices doesn't enter the calculations at all in the beginning. So it's not important. So many features of this bargaining, I'd say, not important. But I cannot answer it with it. So for instance, in one of the bargaining protocols that we tried, the buyer made an offer. The seller, made an offer. But the seller is informed. So when an informed makes an offer, you have all these off-path beliefs. So we had, of course, to supplement the equilibrium there with a refinement to get the results that we need. Because otherwise we have a whole bunch of... So I want to say completely independent, but I cannot say completely independent, but intuitively I think it is independent. The bargaining is not really important here. So there is also, I told you, I said this is generic, we also analyze the non-generic case. You can have in the non-generic cases like some other things happening, like some partial pooling of adjacent states and so forth, but let's not go into it, because in the generic case, it's either complete pooling of adjacent states or complete separation. Now I want to talk about the third scenario. So I'm done with 2 scenarios, the auction and the sequential search, and you saw they were very different, or quite different in terms of information aggregation. The third and less familiar scenario is this auction with bid solicitation. It's a single buyer and n potential bidders, like before. Here we analyze 2 states, okay? It's not just any arbitrary finite number of states, because not everything we want to say we have been able to say so far for any number of states. So let me talk about restricted to 2 states, call them L and H for low and high. So the value in state L is the low value in state H is high value, and the prior, as before, row, everything remains as before, except I restrict attention to 2 states. The seller solicits little n out of this capital N potential buyers. He does it randomly at the marginal cost S. So it's like the sequential search scenario, except the search is simultaneous. The seller decides once and for all how many bidders to summon, or how many buyers to summon. Each solicited bidder privately observes a signal X, like before. The sellers know W, bidders do not know W and do not know N, do not know how many people were summoned with them to this auction. So it's not a formal auction that they sit in a room and they sell the, what they all like to sell, all these auction people, the auction, the spectrum frequency. It's think about it, it's a market, it's like diffuse market, like for the loan, the guy going around and submitting applications and so on. Now, the highest bid wins, and ties are broken randomly. Payoffs when P is the winning bid is for the bidder. The winning bidder is the value minus the price, other bidder 0. The seller is again the revenue minus the cost of solicitation.
And there's just one auction here, there's not,
This is just once.
okay.
It's everything that I talk about, all three models. There is one unit. Once it is sold in an auction in the first scenario. In the second scenario, it's sold by the seller going around selling it. In the third scenario, the seller simultaneously contacts a number of potential bidders and asks them for one unit. Now, the seller's pure solicitation strategy depends on the state, of course, is NL or NH, depending on the state. The bid, it's the bid of a bidder is denoted by beta of x. It maximizes the bidder's expected payoff for every x given. Oh, I'm talking about equilibrium. Sorry, I jumped. The seller solicitation strategy is n. How many bidders in each state? The bidder strategy is beta, is a bidding strategy. You know you've been solicited and you got a signal. How much do I bid? And symmetric and pure strategy equilibrium is a bidding strategy beta, solicitation strategy n. The bidding is optimal for the bidder, knowing the strategies of the seller and the other bidders. The bidder doesn't know. This is bold n. It's not the individual n. The bidder knows the equilibrium strategy of the seller, but not actually how many bidders the seller is summoning right now. And so this is a standard equilibrium concept. But here the seller is also a player. The seller chooses NW to maximize his expected profit, given the bidding strategy of the bidder. So this is like the equilibrium in terms of as far as the bidders are concerned, is like in an ordinary auction, except that in different states they are competing against different bidders. But you have also optimization on the part of the seller in selecting the. So again, here we look at a sequence of such models, and what varies across the different elements of the sequence is the sampling cost S that goes to 0 over the sequence. It's not. This is not only the thing that will vary also over the sequence the set of potential buyers. This capital N is indexed by K. We keep it all the time large enough. Large enough so that the seller will never want to invite everybody. It doesn't have to be a particular size, we don't want the seller to ever want to invite everybody to the auction. Okay? So this is what happens along the sequence, and we look at the sequence of corresponding equilibria, which are bidding for the bidders and solicitation. And then we look at the equilibrium price. Like before, PWK is the winning bid in auction K in state W. It's a random variable. With the upper bar is the limit of this, of these things. And F is the limit distribution of the winning bid in state W. Okay, this is like before. Now, here, what are the results with respect to information aggregation? We have both partial revelation and pooling patterns in this world. So it is, here, I don't know if I mentioned, I should have mentioned, I'm talking now here about the world in which the likelihood ratio at the top is finite. Be any size, but finite, not infinite. So we have partial revelation and pooling. So what do I mean by partial? There exists a sequence of equilibria with partially revealing limit. That means non-degenerate winning bid distributions that are different across the states. And the expectation of them will not coincide with the actual values, but they will be different from one another, as you see by this inequality. State L, what you have, the middle expression, is the ex ante expected value. So they will be on both sides of the ex ante expected value, but they will not coincide with the value. So this behavior is qualitatively like in the ordinary auction. Remember here, we don't have the likelihood ratio at the top is finite. And if we make it larger and larger and larger, this expectation will get closer and closer to the true value. So it is like the ordinary auction in terms of qualitatively. It's not exactly like, but qualitatively it's like the ordinary auction. Under certain conditions, there also exist sequences of equilibria that converge into a pooling outcome, such that the price in state L is equal to the price in state H in the limit. And it's, I say it's smaller, it's slightly below the X ante expected value. So I have two patterns. This pattern is like in the sequential search. Because remember, it's likelihood, I'm doing all this analysis under finite bounded likelihood ratio. And this is more like the ordinary auction. So these two patterns appear in this. And this is indeed this hybrid scenario between the other two scenarios. So it also has results that are hybrids between the two. Yeah.
When you say both of these are possible, do you mean for a given set of parameters both are possible at the same time, or so they're existing?
First of all, as you notice, I put exist, yeah. So this I should explain. Exist in quotation marks, meaning to do existence here, to use standard theorems of existence, we need to make the prices on a grid and then take the grid to zero, and this is what exists. But let's accept this, this is not a problem. This sort of equilibrium always exists. Give me any parameters, this always exists. Always. And for some, in some cases, this also exists. This is another equilibrium. So this sort of equilibrium, they always exist, and under certain condition, this one also exists. So you never have only this one without the other one. And it might be that this also always exists. We just are able to show that it exists under, my suspicion that it always exists. But we're able to show only under certain conditions that it also exists. We don't know what happens in the rest of the space. Not that it doesn't exist, we just weren't able to establish it. But there always exists an equilibrium in the sense of what we call existence, and of this the auction-like form. Now, let me say a few words on this equilibrium, because this is a less familiar scenario. So, the partially revealing equilibrium, the one I showed you on the top, it has a unique form. So, it has a unique limit distributions. It can take, you cannot have in the limit many different equilibria of this form. It will be a unique distribution of the winning bid. It will be a unique ratio, limit of the ratio of the people being solicited, the bidders in NH and NL. And like ordinary auction, as I mentioned, if the likelihood ratio at the top is large, the winning bid distribution will put most of the weight near the true value. This is like in the ordinary auction. And actually, this sort of auction, it, if you take it aggregates information better than the ordinary auction if this limit is greater than 1, and it does it less well if this limit is less than 1. Namely, in the limit, the prices, the expected prices in the different states, there will be a distribution of prices in a different state. But the expected prices in a different state will be closer to the true value. If this is greater than 1, then in the ordinary auction it will be further away if it is smaller than 1. I want to say something, so this I said about the partial derivative. I want to say something about the pooling limit. The pooling limit may exist for arbitrarily informative signals. So the conditions under which that it exists are consistent. Give me some distributions with this being very, very large. Namely, you have signals that are very, 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 very good. There will still be conditions under which this pooling equilibrium exists. So it's not being wiped out by large likelihood ratio. You can have excellent signals and still you get this pooling result. The pooling result requires that in the limit, what happens in the pooling result, that in the limit, this ratio is smaller than 1 over this ratio that goes. So it has to be the, maybe I say it on the next slide. I probably say it somewhere, so I will not say it. So I want to say comparison, some comparison here. How much more time do I have? Am I done?
10 more minutes?
10 more minutes, excellent, exactly. Now this is excellent. So, what have we learned so far? Ordinary auction aggregates information better than sequential search. Ordinary auction, you have high likelihood ratio at the top, you get prices near values. And in the sequential search, you can get prices not informative. Auction with bidder solicitation gives rise both to partially revealing outcomes as in the ordinary auction and to pooling outcomes as in the sequential search. And it's more, there's more or less information aggregation than in ordinary auction depending on this limit of this ratio. The solicitation effect distinguishes the two scenarios with endogenous solicitation, namely the sequential search and the auction with the endogenous solicitation, from the ordinary auction. Why? Because being solicited already contains information that interacts with the signal. Both in the sequential search and in the auction with endogenous solicitation, what happens, a buyer is being contacted. This buyer doesn't think about things, it doesn't evaluate things at the prior. He says, what is the probability that I'm being contacted given, or what is the probability of the state conditional on me being contacted? This is where this ratio of NH over NL comes in. If the seller is contacting many more people in state H, then I learn already something from being contacted. It increases my probability that this is state A. And the same is in the sequential search model. If the seller, on average, the search duration of the seller is longer in one state than in another state, then by me just being contacted, I already update the probability of these two states. I don't evaluate them at the prior. I evaluate them at the prior, updated by the fact that I have been contacted. Yeah?
In the sequential search, you know how many people have been contacted?
No, you don't. You just sit there and the seller comes to you and asks for and offer to you, and you don't know how many people the seller has seen before, and you don't know when he started his search.
So how do you update your...
Because you know in equilibrium, in the sequential search model, in equilibrium in every state, the seller will have a different expected duration of search. Because the probability of generating, let's say the seller looks for a certain signal, the probability of generating this signal will be different in different states. Therefore, the expected duration of search will be different across different states. In equilibrium, I know these different durations. I don't know for how long the search is set, but if I'm being contacted, I know the seller is searching a lot longer in state 2 than in state 1. I update my probability, the prior probability of state 2 versus state 1, I update them using this information.
Got a higher chance that I got chosen.
This is correct, because he's searching longer. Exactly. Now, in ordinary auction, the information aggregation is determined by the relative strength of the signal, and the winner scarce. In the two other scenarios, the winner case is replaced in the sequential search or supplemented in the other scenario by solicitation curse or blessing. The solicitation could be not just depending on whether you are more likely to be solicited in a good state than in a bad state. It could be chaos, it could be a blessing, but this is additional information that values that the bidders use to update their beliefs. Okay, so this is the comparison. I want to say something about allocation of resources. The interesting information aggregation, you can say, why do I care if prices aggregate information or not? The interest in it is motivated by consequences for allocation of resources. In the basic model that I'm considering here, so long as trade takes place, information has no allocative efficiency consequences. But all the buyers here in the simple model that I use value the good more than the sellers, as long as and they all have the same value for the good. So as long as trade takes place, there are no allocative issues here at all. So who cares if prices are aggregated or not? No, this is true in this particular very simple model. Nobody cares, but it's with added structure. You can have here significant allocative consequences, and it's not very difficult to add this structure. For instance, if you think that some VWs are smaller than zero, alternatively you give the seller a cost, and there are some values that are smaller than the seller's cost. So there are some trades that are not beneficial. But if there is no aggregation of information, these trades will take place. If there is aggregation of information, they will not take place. So it's not very difficult to modify the model to bring in the allocation of resource consequences to the model. Another thing, you can think that the seller makes an unobservable investment that shifts the distribution of values. So of course, if the seller can appropriate the whole surplus, the seller might have incentives to do it more than if they don't, and so on. So actually, the two scenarios with the sampling, there are also efficiency questions concerning total search costs. And in the sequential search scenario, we have generic efficiency. So long as these lambdas that I talked to you about are generic, the expected total search cost in the limit will be zero, not just an expected marginal cost, but the expected search cost. In the bid solicitation scenario, by the way, this will not be the case. In the pooling equilibria, there will be zero total search cost in the limit, but in the partially revealing equilibrium, there will be positive search cost. The seller will incur some non-trivial cost in the equilibrium in the limit. Let me say a word. It would be just because I think this last slide might help a little to all the things that to understand some of the things I glossed over. So consider, I want to elaborate a little bit about this comparison. Consider the two-state case now for all scenarios. They are just very good, could be, the state could be L or H. For significant information aggregation, there should be values of the signal such that the expectation in the eyes of a buyer, the expectation of the value, conditional on the signal, conditional on the fact that the buyer is going to transact at some price P. These are close, this expectation is close to the value. This you need it for information aggregation. That at some price close to the value, the expected value is close to the value. This is what you need for information aggregation. Now, this requires that there are values of X such that the buyer will have the probability of H of the high state conditional on X and the transaction taking place at a price close to it will be close to 1. This is just saying the same thing. Now, let me write this probability out. The probability of H given X, transaction at P, close to VH. So this is what it, this base formula, you have here the prior, you have the probability of being solicited in state A, you have here the signal, you have here the probability transacted P, conditional on A, and in the denominator you have this for all states. You can divide it through and you get that this probability is determined by 4 likelihood ratios.
the likelihood ratios coming from the prior, the one coming from the solicitation, the one coming from the signal, and the one coming from the transaction. And now in different scenarios, these things take different values. So, first of all, this ratio, let's call it the winner-scarce effect. The ratio transacted P conditional on H, transacted P conditional on N. In an ordinary auction, this is smaller than 1. In our sequential search model, it could be 0 or 1, because either the two types will be pulled, or they will be separated, and then in the auction with solicitation, again, it will be different than 1. The signal effect is the same in all of them. The solicitation effect, in the ordinary auction, there is no solicitation. You have nothing to learn. In these two other scenarios, the solicitation effect is captured by this ratio. In the auction with solicitation, these are the actual numbers that are being solicited in the different states. In the auction, in the sequential search, this is the expected duration of search in state A as opposed to state A. Now, existence of a probability that, as we said, close to 1, probability of A, condition of X, and transaction will be close to 1, requires that this is large, that the signal effect swamps the winner-scarce effect and the solicitation effect. It has to be that this is large and that it swamps these other effects. Now, what happens in the auction? It swamps. In the ordinary auction, the winner scarce is not too strong, and the signal effect simply swamps it, and this is why you get this perfect correlation. In the sequential search, the solicitation effect could offset the signal effect, regardless of how large the signal effect is. So, for instance, one equilibrium behavior is that the seller of any type searches to a signal above a certain threshold X star. When S is small, this X star is near X upper above. Then the solicitation effect, the expected duration of search, is 1 over the probability of success. So is this in state H and this in state L. And this is more or less 1 over the likelihood ratio at the top. And this exactly offsets the signal effect, because if you multiply this by this, you get 1. So in the sequential search, the sampling effect, in the auction, the winner-scarce effect can never offset the signal effect, or not can never. It doesn't offset the signal effect if the signal effect is strong enough. Here, even if the signal effect is very strong, it can be offset by the solicitation. So this is basically the story. In the auction with solicitation, it's even more complicated, so I will not say. And the conclusion is the main qualitative insight that endogenous solicitation that arises naturally in certain trading scenarios affect information aggregation by prices. It is clear how the endogenous solicitation interferes with aggregation. An informed seller of a lower type solicits more buyers and so gives rise to a solicitation effect that mitigates the signal effect. Sometimes the endogenous solicitation might work in the other direction. The partially revealing equilibrium of the auction will be the solicitation. In certain situations, prices aggregate information better than in the ordinary auction. So it doesn't have to necessarily be always worse than in the ordinary auction. This is it. I'll stop here.
So I have 2 questions. First one, I've asked you in the past, I never got a good answer from you. Can we hire you?
Of course, it depends on the price.
You won't be a winner first. markets, you were a dictator, knowing what you now know, would you organize market, suppose you could require people to trade in a certain way, and strictly in that way, and kill them if they didn't. Would you organize auctions? Would you let people continue doing what they're doing?
But this is it's a little bit too general for me. But I can tell you, for instance, if you didn't even like narrower confines, that for instance, this auction with endogenous solicitation, there is a inefficiency arising here. So if you could force the seller to reveal the number of people soliciting, for instance, you will overcome a certain amount of efficiency. I said that there will be some cost. There will be some solicitation cost, and if the seller, how many bidders the seller is soliciting is observable, this cost will be, well, I have to be careful. Okay, let me say it differently. Suppose, in at least one sort of equilibrium, this cost will be avoided. So this is something I could say, but to give like sort of a sweeping answer, I know too little, and everything here is too simple to give a serious answer about how to organize markets. But so I think this solicitation effect is a real lesson. It's a real lesson that all sorts of things that so information, property, information aggregation, you can think of naturally in an auction. That they are getting interfered with when you have this sort of solicitation. So when people go around, let's say, to shop for a loan, and you don't keep information about them, you don't know how much they are going to shop, they could, if it's not too costly to do it, they could bring you into a situation in which prices will not convey the information. So I think this is a real effect. Now, how to take this effect into consideration when we design things, I don't know. So I hesitate to say, for instance, you can ask questions of whether this history should become observable or not. So I cannot answer it offhand. But I'm saying this sort of thinking about it allows you to at least begin thinking about this question, whether you should impose a regulation that says that the entire history of somebody who's going for a loan, the entire history of loan application should be secret, should be allowed to keep secret, or should be made public. This is a question you can ask once you are aware of these effects. But the answer to it, I don't know. I don't know the question.
All right, well, thanks again.